Downhill bikes are absolutely loaded with the latest tech, and due to the fact that they're actually developed out on the racetrack, we have seen serious innovations in downhill developing over the years. And who better to take you through it all than our own Steve Jones from EMBN. After all, before working on the electric mountain bike network, Jonesy spent a lifetime dedicated to downhill racing. As an editor on Dirt magazine, he was on a life mission to understand what it took to build the best possible downhill bikes. And Steve's even been on the podium at the Masters World Championships in Val di Sole in 2016, where he got a bronze medal. I'll leave you with Jonesy to take you through the story. Innovations in downhill.
There's an argument to say downhill was where it all began, mountain biking that is, and that if it wasn't for the desire to tear down a hill north of San Fran, we'd not be where we are today. But whilst we have reached a remarkable period of refinement of the downhill bike, the sport itself might not be advancing as fast as many of us would like us to believe. But the innovations that have got us here are nonetheless pretty remarkable. The modern downhill bike is one of immense capability. Few riders on earth can push them to their outermost limit. In fact, the frontier of what is now possible on a downhill bike is largely governed by rider skill and bravery. We have now the potential to place a mountain bike into acutely demanding situations at higher speeds with more control, meaning the boundaries of what is possible have changed considerably since the downhill bike became a breed about a quarter of a century ago. However, to be able to reach that perimeter fence where control becomes risk is now the domain of only the most precocious talents. Whilst the origins of the sport of downhill can be traced back to the 1980s, the beginnings of the development of specific equipment for the task start around the 1990s. And it's from this period that we see the greatest innovations taking place. We see the bikes from the likes of the greats such as Pirakis, Herbold, Beneke. As you can tell, these are early days for sure. The 1995 World Cup winning GT bike of Nico Vulio's and the current specialised demo of Loic Bruni are clearly poles apart. Although maybe, by no coincidence, both riders originate from roughly the same area. You could argue that Nico's GT is not really much more than a modified cross-country bike, and that's not really far from the truth. However, it is way ahead of its time in so many ways. And although it lacks travel by today's standards with 100mm, it has a 64.5-degree head angle and weighs in at 29 pounds, which is pretty much where enduro bikes are today. But we begin our story of innovations with the mighty Sunn team, which to this day remains one of the most successful race teams ever. Now, this is the 1995 Sunn Radical from '94 world champion François Gachet. It is a truly incredible piece of machinery, stacked with innovative detail, groundbreaking and complete at the same time. It is also a one-off custom made for one rider. But the previous season bike of Gachet and Anne-Caroline Chausson, who to this day remains the greatest downhill racer ever, is pretty stacked too. I mean, just look at the details. 100mm travel, hydraulic disc brake, Mavic ceramic rims, 8-speed Shimano XTR, 2.2 tyres, a chain guide, Sunn coil shock with piggyback, compression rebound, 12.5-inch bottom bracket, 17.5-inch chainstay with a 43-inch wheelbase, plus of course a bolt-through front axle. With their chief engineer, Olivier Bossard, Sunn brought an approach to racing which had never been seen before. And when they left at the turn of the century, you could argue has never been seen since. Olivier and his team built and developed the team bikes of Nico Vulio's, Anne-Caroline Chausson, Cedric Gracia, Michael Pascal and Fabien Barel from the ground up as systems rather than merely a collection of parts. Each and every rider had their own personal bike built for them. No surprise then that they remain the greatest downhill race team ever, and arguably the birthplace of some of the greatest downhill innovations ever. But returning to that 1995 vintage Sunn bike, there are simply so many pioneering features to the bike you see. 150mm rear axle, 20mm front axle, custom hubs, Formula hydraulic brakes, prototype tyres and suspension that is simply way ahead of its time, and geometry numbers that are not too dissimilar to the Honda bike of 10 years into the future. That's a lot of innovations on one bike, even without talking about the carbon downtube shrouds. In fact, I don't think there has ever been a bike with so many innovations as this one. The 95 and 96 GT LTSs of Nico Vulio's come with our next innovations. Now, we know that Formula have been developing disc brakes at the time. Nevertheless, Nico's bike does come with, well, some pretty crude suspension and cantilever brakes. But it is ahead of the curve in geometry, 64.5 degree head angle, a 342mm bottom bracket, 432mm chainstay, and weighing in at 13.1 kilos. But the key part is the Michelin Comp 16 rubber, definitely one of the main innovations. Nico's GT changes a touch the following year, 1996, and now sports a prototype hydraulic rear disc, and the first prototype triple clamp boxer forks are 150mm travel with sealed rebound and compression cartridges. It became the must-have fork, along with the French rubber. The boxer, whilst maybe not as custom as a Boss unit, the fork was definitely innovative. The weight of Nico's GT is 35 pounds, pretty much the same weight as many downhill bikes today. You could argue then that in over 30 years of development, we've got a little bit more travel, maybe 50mm more, definitely better suspension, bigger discs, bigger wheels. But what about style? Well, whilst Nico was collecting trophies, meanwhile, Jeff Stieber out in California was definitely picking up the pace in terms of development. And one of the great innovations of the era is definitely the Intense M1. And in Sean Palmer and John Tomac nearly picked up successive World Championship golds in 96 and 97. The Intense M1 had 6 to 7 inches of rear travel and was still only around the £30 mark. It has fully adjustable geometry, but more than anything, Stieber brings style and charisma to the sport. Not that that wins titles, but more than a few of the top professional riders chose to ride Intense M1s, badged up with their own sponsor names. Tomac, Minard, Atherton all rode Intense bikes. In fact, G. Atherton's first World Cup win was on an Intense. Or was that a Muddy Fox? 1997 was also the year that the weight of the World Cup winner's bike tipped over the £40 mark for the first time. And it was to be over a decade until they got lighter again. Innovations were coming with a very heavy price tag, no more so than the Cannondale Fulcrum at over 24 kilos, the weight of a modern e-bike, yet with only 150mm travel and 640mm bars. Now, quite how on earth the Cannondale Fulcrum came so close to winning so many races remains a mystery even to this day, especially with the monster 375mm bottom bracket. Still, that was 10mm short of the 385 on Minard's Honda of 2004. But where were we? Ah yes, innovations. Well, there were many during this incredibly intense era. The Synthesi Bazooka, the giant ATX that Warner rode, the B1, the Schwinn Straight 8s, the Konas of Tommy and Poe Misser, and the Trek of Scott Sharples. But there was a storm brewing as downhill moved into the 1998 season, and it had Sunn written all over it. The monumental battles between Steve Peat and Nico Vulio's were as much about technology as rider skill. France versus America, Great Britain, and, well, pretty much everybody wanted to ride that Sunn bike. But consider for a minute the fact that Steve Peat, at 6'3", was riding a bike with the same size and geometry as Nico Vulio's at 5'10". And it doesn't take much imagination to work out who is at the advantage. Nico wins on the 180mm Sunn Radical, and it was radical. Widely considered to be the greatest downhill bike ever made and weighs in at 18 kilos, Nico had nevertheless taken a while to get used to the considerably heavier weight of the longer travel Sunn, compared to his 100mm GT bikes weighing 13 kilos. Now on the Sunn team, for every rider, at every race, they had a custom setup, which went down to the fractions of preload, which affected the balance of the bike. Sunn was all about silence, tracking, speed and grip. And an Olivier Bossard, the first person to bring telemetry to each and every race. Now, Olivier reckoned that 180mm travel, at the time at least, was the optimum. So we have to consider that telemetry is definitely one of the innovations. The aim of V-Process was to make the best dampers available, not simply working on a production item. There were no limits. In a conversation, Bossard tells me the damper on the V-Process cost a massive amount of money, but it paid off as they built a World Cup and World Championship winning bike seemingly overnight. There are many bright ideas as downhill moves into the 21st century, and the optimum amount of travel has yet to be settled too. In 2001, the Santa Cruz V10 has 10 inches of travel, or 250mm. The same year as the V10 was launched, Greg Minnaar wins the World Cup Series on an orange 222 featuring 218mm, so travel then was still being worked out. Nearly 20 years later, today's V10 is 215mm. Now, Nico retired from World Cup racing in 2002 with 7 World Championship titles and 5 World Cup Series wins. So, when one of the greatest downhill racers ever retired from the sport, there was arguably an innovatory void which has never been filled. Things actually get a little bit messy when Nico's gone. Still, there are some innovations. Fox launched the 40, the biggest fork ever, and the mighty Honda Corporation march into the World Cup pits, bringing some secrecy and an internal drivetrain. I was lucky enough to be at the Honda's first race in Motril, Spain, La Hombre du Honda. Yet it was the Showa suspension that people envied more than the rattling gears which could be heard at a distance. At each event, Honda brought with time a team of suspension technicians to make sure Greg Minnaar's Honda RN04 was gripping like no other. So in our Unknown Innovation Award, it has to be Showa. There are other cool details too to the Honda, like their 220mm Formula discs and monster 2.5 Maxxis tyres. Over the next 10 years, the bikes changed dramatically, although, as you can see, the Sunn of 1994 and the Honda of 2004 do share so many similarities. Although considerably more travel, the Honda was able to purr through the heaviest and baddest traffic. I'd argue the Sunn is actually a better looking bike, but looks don't win races, right? Then again, the Sunn was simply so much more successful than the Honda. So as we come to the end of this spectacularly busy period of development, we see that the downhill bike has become a breed in itself, and the sport of downhill, the pinnacle of off-road riding. And if you look at this period, the development of the bikes has enabled us to ride through places like this with more control than ever before. So we leave the story, for now at least, in 2004-2005. And as much as people's attention was focused on the Honda, the actual bike ridden by Minnaar was actually quite small for the frame of the mighty South African. No, it was Frenchman Fabien Barrel and his mechanic Paul Walton who actually lead the major innovations of the next few years. And by taking the Kona and modifying the geometry, arguably they take geometry to the place where the modern downhill bike lives. And it's to prototypes where we return to the story next time.